Welcome to Esoteric Thoughts. I am Napasha Da, and I'd like to first and foremost thank Esoteric for allowing me to sit with the Ralph Ellis and have a great discussion about the historicity of Moses. Hello, Mr. Ellis, Dr. Ellis, Ralph.
Good to be with you, Napa. Nice to be on the show again.
This is a real pleasure for me. I follow your work, and it has helped me in a lot of debates, especially your wonderful work on the Exodus. So now here we are sitting together, and we are going to pick your brain and get some of your knowledge about Moses. The first question off the bat is: was Moses real?
I think so. This is one of the beauties, as it were, of my research, is that a lot of these texts turn out to be real and historical. Not necessarily from the religious spiritual point of view, because I don't do that. I'm just looking at history. But I set out to look for these characters because many people said they exist, and you ask for proof and they have no proof. All they can do is point you towards the Old Testament, the Torah, and say, well, you know, he's in the Torah. Well, fine, yes, but that's not history. And even when I was very young, I mean, going back into junior school and so on, people said, well, why don't you believe this? And I said, well, you cannot find the history. And so I'd read all of the biblical texts, mostly at that stage, the New Testament, but also the Old Testament. And I discovered that I generally knew more than the people I was arguing with. So they were arguing from a position of ignorance, and they still could not give any historicity to these particular people. All of the people, all of the characters in the Old Testament, not just Moses. And so at some point, I decided to start looking for them. And as you say, I've done all of these connections with the Hyksos Exodus and the biblical Exodus. And of course, when you do that, you start to come across these characters perhaps in the historical record. And one of the characters I came across was Moses, because it's not widely known that there is more information about Moses within the Old Testament and within Josephus than most people think. So, for instance, Moses, who's Moses? He has several names, of course, like all of these characters. So Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph, his name was Petaseph. That comes from the books of Manetho, who gives the Egyptian name of Joseph, who is Petaseph. And he also gives the name for Moses, who is called Osaseph. Now, these are said to be Egyptian names, and if we translate them back in from the Egyptian, it seems that they are correct. So they are using the proper names for these people, most likely. So what does it mean? Well, Manetho says for Osiris, for Osaseph, he says the name comes from the god Osiris. So it's Osaseph. And if we look up Seph in the Egyptian dictionary, we find it means son or child, the son of. So the name means the son of Osiris, which is a standard Egyptian name, because all of the important people, all of the pharaohs of Egypt, were all the sons of gods. That was just a standard appellation. Ramesses is the son of Ra. Tuthmosis is the son of Thoth, or Thoth, or Jehuti, as he was known in Egyptian. So Osaseph is a good name within Egyptian for an important character. He is the son of Osiris. And Joseph was called Petaseph. Okay, so if we know that Seph means son of, then Petaseph obviously means the son of Ptah, another Egyptian god. And that's interesting because Ptah was the god of architects, masons, carpenters. We can see the connection here with the New Testament Joseph. So he was the son of Ptah, who was the god of architects. And then if we look into the Old Testament, Joseph was also called Zatnath Paneah, or Josephus says Sotham Panish, obviously the same name with a different pronunciation. So again, this is said to be the Egyptian name for Joseph. And I might as well, since I'm here, get a reference just in case people don't believe, because people are always skeptical, but there we go. Genesis 41:45. And it says in that verse, Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zatnath-paneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, the priest of On. On is Heliopolis. And Joseph went all over the land of Egypt. So his Egyptian name was Zatnath-paneah. Well, we've already seen the translations from Manetho's version. So what does, well, if we split it up, it's not all one word, of course. It's Zatnath-paneah. Well, the Zaph is quite obviously another rendition of Seph, which we've had in the other names, Petaseph, Osaseph, Sephneth. So what does Sephneth mean? Well, I mean, it doesn't necessarily come from me, this. This was first translated, as far as I know, in 1820 by Adam Clarke, who was one of the venerable old theologians from that era, 19th century. And he said that Nath was actually Neith. Neith was a goddess of Egypt, and she was the great architect of the universe, which is interesting because that name goes alongside someone who's known for being an architect, of course, and she was the great architect of the universe, exactly as we find within Masonry. The only difference being that within Freemasonry, modern Freemasonry, the great architect of the universe is generally thought of, I suppose, as being male. But in this case, in Egypt, the great architect of the universe was a female, and she was called Neith. So Sephneth is the son of Neith. And of course, that makes perfect sense because Neith was the wife of Ptah. So we've got a husband and wife, gods of Egypt, Ptah and Neith. And Joseph, Old Testament Joseph, was said to be the son of Ptah and the son of Neith, which he would be if they were married together as gods in heaven above. And he was their son. He would be the son of Ptah and the son of Neith, which is what we get. And remember, we get this from two different texts. So one is from the Old Testament, one is from Manetho. So we've got two very different texts that are giving us the name of the Old Testament Joseph. So this gives us some confidence that they knew what they were talking about, because they are giving valid Egyptian history that makes sense. And these people were in Egypt. They were important people in Egypt. Joseph was the prime minister of all Egypt. He was married to the daughter of the high priest of Heliopolis. Therefore, he was probably a high priest of Heliopolis himself at some point. Very important people. It gives us confidence that perhaps these texts are actually correct. And for Moses, of course, it's directly given from Manetho. Manetho says that his name was Osaseph, from Osiris, who was the god of Heliopolis. But when he was gone over to these people, to the Hyksos, his name was changed and he was called Moses. That comes from Against Appian 26. So we have this from other texts. We're not just reliant on the Old Testament here, that Moses was an important person within Egypt and he was a leader. And we get this from Josephus as well. And this is interesting because Josephus gives us an alternative Old Testament. So Joseph wrote his own Old Testament based on an earlier document that we have. So he based his history of the Jews from the Torah that was in the temple in AD 70. And he says that that Torah dated back to the time of Xerxes. So we're talking about 5th, 6th century BC, much, much earlier than any Torah that we have today. And Josephus was given those texts by Emperor Vespasian and said he could keep them. And from those texts and from other texts, he wrote his Antiquities of the Jews, which is basically an Old Testament, except it's a secular Old Testament. And being a slightly different document, it has slightly different information. And that's interesting because, again, we get another view of the biblical story. And so, of course, he talks about the Exodus and he talks about Moses, but he gives a different story about Moses. So Moses was, according to Josephus, was the chief army commander of the Egyptians. So he's being elevated now. He's the chief army commander of all of Egypt. And he was sent by King Thutmose, and we have to decide who Thutmose was. He was sent by Pharaoh Thutmose to go down into Nubia to defeat the Nubians. And he does. So he's sent down into, what does it say? It says, just to quote some of this so people know that, this is actually what it says. Moses, at the persuasion of Thutmose, the king, the pharaoh, cheerfully undertook the business, this campaign going south. And the sacred scribes of both nations were glad. Those of the Egyptians, they should be overcome by their, should at once overcome their enemies by his valor. He was obviously a very valiant general of the army. And so it goes on. So he leads, it's quite a long text, actually. It's a while since I've been through this, so I must go through this again. But anyway, it goes on for several paragraphs. And then he attacks the city. So this is Moses. This is the biblical Moses that everyone says, is one of the great patriarchs of the Israelites and Judaism. It says the place was to be besieged. So now he's down in Nubia, which is obviously south of Egypt, heading into Nubia, modern sort of Sudan, I suppose, that sort of area. The place to be besieged was besieged with great difficulty, since it was both encompassed by the Nile, quite around, and by other rivers. So it's obviously on the confluence of two rivers here, which is probably down perhaps where the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet, south of Egypt. The city was situated in a retired place and was inhabited after the manner of an island, being encompassed by a strong wall and having rivers to guard them from their enemies, and having great ramparts between the wall and the rivers. However, while Moses was uneasy at the armies lying idle, for their enemies would not come to battle, this accident happened. And then it goes on to explain. Tharbis was the daughter of the king of Nubia, well, it says actually here of the Ethiopians. There's always a confusion between Ethiopia and Nubia in these texts. Half of them will say Ethiopia, and the other half will say Nubia. Of course, in modern terms, they are different places. We're not quite sure exactly where Moses went to, whether he went to Ethiopia or whether he was just to the south of Egypt in Sudan. I would imagine he was probably in Sudan because it is mentioning this city was on the banks of the Nile, which might suggest we're talking about Nubia here. Anyway, so Tharbis was the daughter of the king of the Ethiopians, and she happened to see Moses as she led the army near the walls and fought with great courage and admiring subtlety of his undertakings, believing him to be the author of the Egyptians' success. When they had despaired of recovering their liberty and to be of the occasion of the great danger of the Ethiopians. Then it goes on, and then she fell deeply in love with him. And upon that passion sent to him the most faithful of all of her servants to discourse with him about their marriage. Then he accepted the offer on condition she would deliver up the city to him, and gave her the assurance of oath to take her to his wife. Once the oath had been taken, he took possession of the city, and he would not break his oath to her. No sooner was the agreement made, but it took effect immediately. And when Moses had cut off the Ethiopians, he gave thanks to God and consummated his marriage with Tharbis. So there is a very different story to the one we get in the Old Testament. So we have Moses as the chief army commander of the Egyptians. So we're not talking about slaves in Egypt again. We're talking about very important, very powerful people within Egypt. We're talking about an army commander who takes the Egyptian army down into Sudan, Nubia, and he defeats this city-state that he attacks, and then he marries the Nubian queen, Tharbis, and takes her back to Egypt. Very different story to the one we normally get. So this is power politics of very important people. This is not a story of slaves in Egypt at the mercy of the evil Egyptians. I mean, this guy was the chief army commander. He had more power than the Pharaoh did with his army at his beck and call. So we're seeing a glimpse into the real Torah, the real story of Moses and Jacob and Joseph and all of the others, that these were important and powerful people. And from my other work, as you probably know, and the Exodus account that I've decoded, they were the Hyksos. So they were the Hyksos shepherd kings of Egypt, and they ruled Egypt up until the time that they were kicked out of Egypt, 1580 BC, roughly. So 16th century BC. The only caveat to that is that on reading Manetho, we might be talking about a second Exodus here. So in fact, we are, as far as I know, we're talking about the second Exodus. So, and the Moses character does not belong to the first Exodus. So the first great Exodus within the historical record is the Hyksos Israelite Exodus out of Egypt. That was 1580 BC, quite a long time ago, way before, standard Judaism would mention. And that was the end of that. So that was 1580 BC. But then they came back into Egypt with the Joseph story of Joseph going back down into Egypt. So they came back into Egypt to resettle what they considered to be their lands. And then Manetho gives us the story of a second Exodus. which was his exodus of 80,000 lepers and maimed priests. And quite clearly, when you're reading this, it's quite obviously something to do with the Amarna dynasty of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. That's what it's talking about. When it's talking about when it's talking about the 80,000 lepers and maimed priests who are banished to the quarries on the east bank of the Nile, that's exactly what happened to Akhenaten. Yeah.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
I vaguely recall doing some research and reading that Osasef was the leader of the lepers. So how do we connect Osasef with Akhenaten?
Yes. So Osasef is Moses. And yes, if he was a part of the Amarna dynasty, we happen to have the curious connection that the brother of Akhenaten was called Moses. So we have a real known historical character who was the brother of Akhenaten, and his name was Moses. Moses. You see, when they're giving you Moses, they're being deliberately deceitful, because I'm pretty sure they must have known the names of these people. But rather than giving the full name, they just give you Moses, which just means son of. But the son of who? They've deliberately deleted the God name, so you don't know who this person is. Run through the Old Testament, through the Torah and the Tanakh, and look for Pharaoh. And Pharaoh is never named until you get all the way up to Shishak, in the United Monarchy. Pharaoh is never named. And that is deliberate, because they didn't want you to know exactly when the era was and exactly what was going on. And the easiest way to cover that up is to chop off some of the names of these people. It's like when Pharaoh's daughter comes up and marries King David. Oh, Pharaoh's daughter. Yeah, marvelous. Thank you. But what's her name? And they've deliberately suppressed her name again, so you don't know exactly what they're talking about. But when reading the Kebra Nagast, which is the Ethiopian Bible, if you've ever read that book, it's very interesting, actually. It's quite obviously that she was called Makshara, or in Egyptian terms, she was Makara. She was Makara Mutemhat, who was the daughter of Susens II, 21st dynasty. We're running on a little bit into later dynasties here, but I'm just sort of explaining that, they've deliberately missed off the names of these people to confuse the text, so you don't know what they're exactly talking about. It's like Josephus when he's talking about the Edessans, going on into much later, into the 1st century. And Josephus says that the army that came down to help King Aretas of Petra was some fugitives from Syria. And you think, oh, thank you, Josephus. Why don't you tell us who these people are? Some fugitives from Syria. And then you read the Syriac historians, and they say that this was the army of the Edessan king, Abgarus V. Now you get the name, but you see how Josephus has deliberately deleted the name, so you don't know exactly what's going on.
I'd like to ask you, I know we don't have a lot of time, but why is it that there's so much of that information that is occult and arcane? Why is it deliberately hidden? Why do you think?
Because they wanted to sell a different story. The story of the Israelites, excuse me. The story of the Israelites as the most powerful people in the world, being kicked out of Egypt did not resonate with its people. In order to keep people together, you need to sell a story of oppression. So we are the poor oppressed people. It was those evil Egyptians that were against us. And we have to stick together. Excuse me.
So I don't want to, I know you're in the middle of your statement, but I just want to ask you, are we talking about, I call it the cult of Moses. So when you say they had to stick together, are we talking about the exodus of the Hyksos and the lepers together? Were they trying to unite them?
Well, they're actually in two different eras, but they've spun the same story out of both of them. So the Hyksos was 1580 BC, quite a long time ago. And then the 80,000 lepers and maimed priests was not until about 1320 BC. So we're talking at least sort of 300 years between the two. But they're both trying to sell the same story. In order to keep these people together as a community, it's much easier to do so if you sell a story of oppression, because that keeps people together. You've got to stay together as a group, as a community, because you're being oppressed by these evil Egyptians. And the only way we're going to survive is to keep together and protect ourselves against these evil Egyptians. That's the story they wanted to sell to keep their people together. To say that we actually were the most powerful people in the world, but we still lost this civil war, is not quite such an easy sell to the people. And I think the priests understood that. It's been copied ad infinitum by many groups throughout history, even in recent history, by Islam, even by Christianity. You look at early Christianity, and it's all about, the martyrs who were killed by those evil Romans. It's a story of oppression again. Stick together because we're being oppressed by the Romans. They did exactly the same, and they altered their history to match that. I wouldn't say it's a complete fantasy of oppression, because some of them were being oppressed. The Jewish Christians, the Nazarene, were being oppressed, but the standard Christians of St. Paul, were not being oppressed. But it suited their agenda to have this this concept and this idea of oppression to keep the people together, and that is how they crafted the Old Testament. And so we end up with these two Exodus events, according to manetho, so according to history, these two Exodus events, which have been amalgamated into one within the biblical text. And so you can't really see the difference between the two in the Torah story. But really, originally, there were two Exodus events, 300 years apart, more. And they were quite different in a way. But I mean, the same people, because the Hyksos Israelites had come back into Egypt with the Joseph story. So the Joseph story is quite clear that they came back into Egypt with him and his brothers. And Joseph, as we know, and we've talked about, went on to become the prime minister of Egypt. And Moses likewise became very important. And that was quite clearly, according to manetho, that was the story of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who were banished to the east bank of the Nile at Amarna in central Egypt, to the stone quarries on the east bank of the Nile to build their new city of Amarna. And that was circa 1320 odd BC.
So, excuse me. So yeah. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were banished. They didn't choose to do that?
A bit of both. you've got to imagine that Akhenaten is this new hippie type guru with a different idea of religion, completely different to the rest of Egyptian religion and Egyptian tradition, of course. His father was still alive, so he was not pharaoh at the time, although he assumed the title of pharaoh. But his father was still alive and ruling in the rest of Egypt. So it's half of one and half of the other, really. He was banished because he was not very popular, quite obviously. So he took his followers and went to somewhere that was completely barren, unused. So this was a new plain on the east bank of the Nile, which had never been settled before. And he built his new city there. And it's quite obvious he did that as a bit of a power play, because it's right in the center of Egypt, saying, right, I'm at the very center of Egypt. But I can't go to Thebes, I can't go to Tanis, I can't go to the major centers, north and south. I'm going to park myself right in the middle of Egypt, and I'm going to declare myself as Pharaoh, even though he wasn't, because his father was still reigning. So they had this co-regency. And I think it was probably a bit of an uneasy co-regency, because Akhenaten was so radical in his new beliefs and his new religious system. And I've said this before, but if anyone wants to know exactly what happened at this time, because it's sometimes difficult to grasp what was going on all of those, 2,000, 3,300 years ago. It's a long time ago. But exactly the same happened just a decade or a couple of decades ago. This is the Ranjish, I think, community who settled in Oregon. And there's a film, you've probably seen it on Netflix, Wild Wild Country. That is Akhenaten. The story is exactly the same, of this popular guru who led his people out into the middle of nowhere in the center of Oregon somewhere to create this new city from nothing, and all of their trials and tribulations and their fractious arguments with the locals out there, and how they became very successful. But then they became a police state. I mean, it became very, very oppressive towards the end of it. They tried to poison the local town of local people. And then it all sort of broke down into infighting, and they all had to go out on an exodus because it failed. That is exactly what happened to Akhenaten. That's the Akhenaten story of this charismatic new leader who led his people out into the quarries on the east bank of the Nile, as Manetho calls it, to build his new city, goading his people on to ever greater feats, because he wanted the best city in the whole of Egypt, working them to their deaths. And we know that from the mass burials at Amarna, where all of the workers were piled up in mass graves, and they all had suffered very, very hard work and very poor nutrition as well. So we know that his workers, although they were his supporters, I doubt if they were slaves as such, his supporters were so enamored with this new religion that they were working themselves to death on his behalf. And so when we come back to the biblical story, and it's saying about Moses and his people, the Israelites in Egypt, Pharaoh is saying to the people, you are idle, you are idle. You must make bricks whether you have straw or not. The only thing that the Bible doesn't tell you about is what is the name of the Pharaoh, because that would give the game away, because the name of the Pharaoh was Akhenaten. So it was their own leader, it was their own Pharaoh that was goading them on to ever greater feats to build his new city, which he was trying to build from nothing on the east bank of the Nile. And so it wasn't some evil Pharaoh, nothing to do with these people, a completely different society and place. It was their own leader. It was their own Pharaoh goading his people on to ever greater feats. You are idle, you must make mud bricks whether you've got straw or no straw. And of course, this new town was all made of mud bricks because they couldn't quarry enough stone to make it.
I'd like to ask, this is very interesting. You bring to mind some of the questions I have about Moses as the leader and the wilderness. I've done some research on Mount Sinai, Sarabit al-Qadim, and because when I hear about oppression, and there's a particular story in the Bible where I'm like, why is Moses, when he goes up to the mountain, then he's upset because they thought he was dead, and he punishes them. And so let me ask you, first off, do you have any information on the wilderness and the Exodus in the Sinai Peninsula? And can you touch on that story and maybe give us some of your insight about that?
Yes. And I don't want to shock you too much, but I have a very different take on what they were doing because they weren't in the Sinai. Not possible. You have to ask yourself, these are highly literate people who wrote everything down. How on earth can the Jews, the Israelites, lose their sacred mountain when they record everything? It's not possible. Of course, they haven't lost it. They know exactly where it is, but they don't want to admit where it is because that would give the game away. Same as, not mentioning who the Pharaoh was. It will give the game away. And so they've altered the story slightly in order to put you off the scent a little. How do we find where Mount Sinai is? Well, that's fairly easy. We look at the descriptions we have of Mount Sinai and where these people were coming from. Remember, if this was the Akhenaten exodus out of Amarna, they would be heading out of Middle Egypt and heading northwards, yeah? Both him and Nefertiti and Kia, his other wife, and all of the people from Amarna who were kicked out. So Mount Sinai is a mountain of God for a start. So this is a sacred mountain, the mountain of God. It's on the edge of a desert. It's the largest mountain in the region. But it's small enough that you can cordon it off. You can put a barrier around it so people can't touch it. They weren't supposed to touch it because it was sacred. So it's relatively small, even though it's the biggest mountain. It has a cave inside it where God lived. There was a possibility of having smoke and fire on the top of it, like a beacon. And at the bottom of this mountain, there was a blackish or a bluish pavement that was so smooth it looked like the night sky. Oh, and it was sharp and difficult to climb as well. Okay, so where do we find a mountain like that on the way out of the Exodus, towards Jerusalem? It's quite obvious, but you need a very, very lateral, free-thinking mind in order to see it. And in order to see it, what we need to see is what is lacking in the Torah story. So what is missing from the Torah story? Considering that Joseph was high priest of Heliopolis, Moses was the chief army commander of all of Egypt. These were very important people in Egypt, Heliopolis is at Cairo, basically, just north of Cairo. What is missing from the biblical text? Well, the thing that's missing is if you get an electronic Bible and you type in pyramid, press enter, and it will say nothing found. How on earth could Joseph live in Cairo and never mention the Giza pyramids? It's not possible. Did Joseph never go to the Giza pyramids for a cup of tea, as Egyptians do to this very day? You see them taking tea there. Just, you know, it's one of the sites that people go to all the time. But of course, in those days, it would be a sacred site. So Mount Sinai is the Great Pyramid of Egypt because it is a sacred mountain. It is the largest mountain in the whole of Egypt, but it is small enough that you can cordon it off, so you weren't allowed to touch it. It is sharp and it's difficult to climb. And it does have a cave inside it. It has a cave, which was always open. And we know it was always open because Strabo describes it. Strabo, who's sort of like 1st century BC, he says that on the north side of the Great Pyramid, there is a stone that you can pull up and a tunnel will take you down into the foundations of the pyramid. So that was always open. The upper chambers weren't open. So the king's chamber, the queen's chamber, that was all blocked off. You couldn't find those. But the tunnel that went all the way down to the bottom of the Great Pyramid was always open in that era. We know that from Strabo. And of course, the clincher on this one is at the base of the pyramid on the east side of the Great Pyramid. You will find the great black basalt pavement that was as smooth and looked like the night sky. That's on the east side of the pyramid, exactly as it says within the Torah story. So I know it's probably shocking because you've probably
I'm
not heard.
actually I have some questions.
Yeah, I'm sure you do.
Yes, because I mean, is it okay that I kind of
Yeah,
pushed you back on that
of course.
a little? Okay. Obvious question. How could that possibly correlate to the story of them being in the wilderness for so long if they were right in the center of Kemet, of Egypt?
Well, it is in the desert. So the Great Pyramid is sitting in the desert. So it's not in the valley floor. It's up on the plateau. So it's in the what the Egyptians called the desert. And from that, we get the word desert. So it is in the desert. What else was I going to say on that? Oh, yes, they were supposed to be in the desert for 40 years, which is fairly impossible because if you were in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years, the Sinai Peninsula is an extension of the Sahara Desert. I don't think you would last 40 days, let alone 40 years in the wilderness. That is a sign of initiation, which has been used throughout the Torah story. So you'll find that, you know, King David reigned for 40 years. King Solomon reigned for 40 years. The number 40 crops up all the time. You've got 40 days and nights in the wilderness within the New Testament. Everything has something to do with the number 40. And they were 40 years in the wilderness, wandering around Sinai. What does that refer to? Well, it so happens that the Giza pyramids were mathematical. So the Great Pyramid is a copy of the formula for a circle. It's 2 pi r. Exactly 2 pi r within about 4 centimeters, you know, for such a vast building. It encompasses 2 pi r in its design, its base length to its height and things of that nature. And we still use these measurements even today. So the Great Pyramid is 1,760 cubits around the base, exactly. So where does that number come from in the modern era? Actually, I don't even know where you're based. You're based in Britain, are you? Not America? Yes.
I'm in the United States.
Are you in the United States? Right. Okay. I didn't know.
I'm in the Southwest, actually.
Ah.
And I actually am in the desert. Fun fact, here in the Southwest, it's the hottest desert in the world, the Death Valley. But
Yes.
I have to go back to the Pyramid of Giza, because wasn't it at the time between what is it called, Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt? Is that what it was called? Wasn't it right in the center?
Not really. I mean, it's at Cairo, so it's very much within the bounds of Lower Egypt. Upper Egypt was Thebes down the bottom. Lower Egypt was Cairo and the Nile Delta. And Giza is at Cairo. So it's really in Lower Egypt. And then Akhenaten had his city right in the center of Egypt at modern Elmina. But going back to the measurements, the measurement 1,760 is the number of yards in an imperial mile. And that is the measurement that's used for the Great Pyramid. The Great Pyramid is 1,760 cubits around the base. Why are they the same? They are the same because they're both based on pi. So the imperial mile and all of the imperial units are based on pi, 22/7. That's why the furlong is 220 yards. The chain is 22 yards, 22/7, that's pi. And the rod is 5.5 yards. It's a quarter of pi. So we're using, in American terms, we're still using the same measurement system, ratios, that they were using in Egypt. And the reason that we get this number 40 that keeps dropping out of it, 40 years in the wilderness, is the Great Pyramid is a 40 times copy of pi. So if you get pi, 22/7, multiply by 40, you get the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. And that was a secret that you would only know if you had been initiated into the secrets, the metrology of the Giza Plateau. And so as a new priest, as a new king, as a new perhaps aristocrat, a new Freemason of that era, you would be initiated into the secrets of the pyramid builders. And one of those secrets was that the Great Pyramid is a 40 times copy of pi. And that's why they're mentioning 40 years in the wilderness. It is a code word that the author of this text understood the metrology of the Giza pyramids. And the kings did as well, Solomon and David. That's why their reign length of 40 years. It's just saying, I know the secrets of the Great Pyramid.
Wow, it's not a secret anymore.
No,
Rabbi Ellis. If I can get a little bit more into the prototype of, I say prototype of Moses, talking about Sargon, the emperor of Acadia, the Akkadian emperor. Can you talk to us about the similarities and then explain to us, well, how can this have been a real character, as the information you've given us is very intriguing. But there's this prototype and there's so many similarities. So can you explain that?
This is talking about the guy in Babylon that was set forth on a raft down the river, etc., the same as Moses was. Yeah, this is a ubiquitous story that pops up in several ancient mythologies. And the question then becomes, who is borrowing from who? We're not quite sure, because a lot of people, especially in the modern era, will say that Babylon came first. That's the originator of all of civilization, came out of Babylon, out of Mesopotamia. I don't think they're correct. I think the originator was Egypt. And those traditions spread to Mesopotamia. And that Egypt goes back a lot longer than people actually think. One of the reasons for thinking so is that the originators, the original civilization, would be something to do with the megalithic era. And we have all of these megaliths across the world. Central America, South America, we have them in Egypt, we have them in Britain, we have them even out in the East and so on. Baalbek and so on in the Levant, on the Eastern Mediterranean, has some of the biggest stones ever quarried, 1,400 tons. That's the megalithic era. And that to me is one of the founding civilizations, is the megalithic era. But there are no megaliths, as far as I know, down in Mesopotamia. There are in Egypt, of course. We've got all of the pyramids. We've got the Assyrian. We've got loads of megaliths in Egypt, but we don't get them in Mesopotamia. Not that I know of, unless someone wants to show me where they are. And so I think that the originating civilization was Egypt. And so the stories came out of Egypt, and they were adopted in Mesopotamia thousands of years ago, of course, but they came originally out of Egypt. Same as a lot of their gods and goddesses have great similarities with the Egyptian religion. And I think the transfer was from Egypt to Mesopotamia. And so this story of the raft out on the Nile, you've got a couple of possibilities here. It's almost the same as the story of Osiris. So Osiris, of course, he was killed, put into a coffin and left adrift on the Nile to get caught in a tree, and then he was rediscovered, etc. It's very much the Osirian story. And remember, if we go back to Manetho, Manetho says his name was Ososeph, from the god Osiris, who was the god of Heliopolis. But when he was gone over to these people, the Hyksos Israelites, his name was changed and he was called Moses. So Manetho himself is saying that Moses was connected to Osiris, and therefore he should have the founding myth of Osiris, which was being left to drift down the Nile in a coffin or in a basket. It's the same story. And I think that's where the story came from. So I think the fact that you've got this same story arrives in Mesopotamia as well is secondary. I think the primary story was the god Osiris and the story of Moses. And then Sargon and the other stories are secondary. It's same with the Noah story. The Noah story of the flood and the ark with the animals 2 by 2 is pure Egyptian. So the Ark of Ra was a great ark in which the animals went in 2 by 2. Because remember, all of the gods were animal gods, and they were all husband and wife gods, so they all went in 2 by 2. And they sailed across the great sea of Nu, from which we get Noah. So Noah wasn't necessarily the captain of the ark, as it were. Nu was actually the ocean they were sailing on, was called Nu. And of course, within Egyptian creation myth, the heavens above were a watery chaos. So you've got to be careful anytime that they are talking about water within biblical type and Egyptian texts. They might be talking about the sea, but they might be talking about the heavens above, because the heavens above were the great sea of the gods and the goddesses. So it was a heavenly sea. And they sailed across these heavenly seas above in this great ark, the great ark of Ra. And they were looking for the first sign of order within the chaos of Nu, which came as a primeval mound within the chaos of Nu. And they sent out the phoenix to go and search for this land. And the phoenix found and stood on this primeval mound. It is the Genesis story of the ark and the birds going out from the ark to find land. It's the same story. It comes straight out of Egypt. And okay, this story has been copied because we get similar stories in Mesopotamia, but I think that is probably secondary, and they've borrowed from Egypt.
In your research, so just to ask you to elaborate a little bit, were the civilizations, what is it, contemporary, or who? So basically, you think that Kemet, Egypt, came first?
Yes. Well, we have a problem with the dating because classical dating will only date the Giza pyramids to 4,500 years ago. Okay, that's supposed to be the old kingdom of Egypt. But a lot of people, including myself, think that the Giza pyramids date back at least 12,000 years, not 4,500 years. And so if that is true, if the megalithic era is actually much older than we think, then we've got a whole raft of history that is sort of missing from the classical story of Egypt, in which case those traditions could have flowed into Mesopotamia at a very, very early date. Now that's controversial because, you know, classical history will insist that the pyramids are only 4,500 years ago. But if you look at some of the erosion patterns you have on the pyramids, especially on the mortuary temple and so on, just below the Great Pyramid and the Second Pyramid, there is a vast amount of erosion. I mean, we're talking 1 meter, 2 meters of erosion on these sandstone blocks. You don't get 2 meters of erosion within 4,500 years. It's all pointing to something that is much, much older. And then in one of my recent talks, I was doing some astrotheology dating of the pyramids and of Stonehenge. And the dates I was coming out with were anything up to 66,000 years ago. 66,000. Even I think that's getting beyond the realms of possibility. But you know, some of these monuments could last that long. It's quite possible. But I was doing it via precession and obliquity. So the angle of the tilt of the Earth, its obliquity, changes over a 40,000 year cycle. But if you're aligning your particular monument, your megalithic monument, with the stars, you will encode that alignment into your monument. And so all you need to do is measure the monument, compare it with the graph of obliquity, which we have from scientists have calculated this. Lascar, he's a French professor. He has calculated obliquity for the last 25 million years. So he's taking it right back into history. That's how stable the angle is, the change in the angle. It changes by 2 degrees, 2.5 degrees. So it's quite a large change. So you can use that data and you can plot backwards where you think these alignments are actually pointing. And with the obliquity angle of Giza and of Avebury and Stonehenge, we seem to get dates that point to something like there's a date at 26,000 years ago, and there's a date at 66,000 years ago. Obviously, you can go back in the past as long as you want. The cycle repeats. The obliquity cycle is 40,000 years, and that just repeats back into the past as long as you want to go. And you've got to decide which of these alignments is most likely. Is it 26,000 years ago, or is it 66,000 years ago? And then it's up to us to decide which one is more likely. But, you know, if any of this is true, if any of the erosion patterns are true, if any of the astronomical alignments are true, then we might have a much older history for Egypt than people currently think.
Wow, yes, even if it is 26,000 and not 60, that's still a significant difference between
Very old,
what we know
yes.
now.
Yes.
That's really interesting. Say, what is it called again?
Obliquity, it's the tilt
Obliquity.
angle of the Earth.
Okay, that is interesting.
Which changes the climate as well. I studied this initially in terms of doing my Egyptian research, because a lot of people have known for a long time that some of these monuments might be modified, their alignments might be modified by precession, which is the precession. It's the wobble of the Earth. So it has two movements. It has this wobble like a gyroscope, but it also the tilt angle changes as well. So you've got two different movements going on. So I studied that in terms of Egyptology to start with. But then I wrote a climate paper, a paleoclimate peer-reviewed paper on how the ice ages work. Because I was concerned, this was about 5-6 years ago, I was concerned that even at that time in the 21st century, we didn't know how ice ages are controlled. People were just guessing. And so I set out to understand how ice ages were properly controlled. And I discovered the answer. Part of that answer, as everyone has known for a long, long time, is due to precession and obliquity. So I had to study those two elements, because it's that change in the orbit of the Earth which is the initiator of interglacials and glacial periods. But the problem was, what is the feedback that goes alongside that? And every scientist, of course, in the world is obsessed with CO2. And that's all they were looking at. And every paper that they produced was just full of holes. They were like calendars, you know, they had so many holes in them, it was untrue. But my theory, which has been taken up by quite a few people now, is it's nothing to do with CO2. It's actually controlled by dust and albedo. So it's the reflectivity of the ice sheets, not CO2, that controls the temperature on Earth. So that's fairly controversial as well, you might say. But the paper has been downloaded 50,000 times now. So it's quite well read, and nobody has been able to falsify it, which is interesting, because I get the same in both elements of my research, whether it's paleoclimatology or whether it's, you know, Old Testament and New Testament. And you get all these critics saying, rubbish, rubbish, Ellis is wrong. Yeah, okay, what do you disagree with? And then they all go quiet, because they can't actually falsify what I'm saying. With the Old Testament work and New Testament work, everything I'm quoting comes out of the original texts. The only difference is my interpretation of those. And now we're sort of just arguing about interpretation, but the basic facts are the same. You can look them up. They come from Josephus, they come from the Old Testament, they come from Manetho. These are standard texts that anyone can get at a flick of a switch on the computer. So you can't argue with my essential data that I get this from.
Yes, and I appreciate we appreciate your research. It is definitely unconventional, your findings,
I
but
like
I
being
do.
unconventional.
Yes, I think that is the way you should be, because it keeps us on our toes, sharp, and we start to really look past the exoteric and look into the esoteric. Um, I would like to have you touch on the actual politics of what I say the cult of Moses. Um, because you did talk about the stories being changed to control the masses, to get the masses to come together. So I want to really focus on Torah, the Pentateuch, and how it's said that it's written by Moses. You can touch on that if you agree that there are several different writers. But I also want you to talk to us about the politics of the social control of that actual of the law and how it worked out for that group.
Well, that is key, really. So yes, that's a very good question. That is key, because otherwise we would not have this history. This history has only survived because the people survived. And the people only survived because they had a very, very close-knit, cohesive society and religion. Obviously, they're intertwined, that kept the people together and therefore kept the texts together, so that these texts were transmitted down through the millennia, almost verbatim, without change. We don't get that from Babylon because those societies failed. We don't get that from Rome so much, even because that society failed. We just get them. Obviously, we've got a lot of Roman texts that were left over, but Roman society itself failed, as it were, as did the Greeks, as did the Muslim empire failed, although we still have texts from there. So many empires have failed over the millennia, and we have lost their texts. And this is one of the very few that has survived from very ancient times, because if the first Exodus was in 1580 BC, we're talking back in the Bronze Age here, the very start of civilization. And yet we've got exact records of what happened at that time. And that was, one of the aspects that gave me the confidence that this was real, because with the Exodus story, I think I've talked about this before, but we've got 5 or 6 different pieces of evidence pointing towards this being a maritime volcanic eruption. And how would any author at that time, any chronicler, know that all of those aspects of what happened at that time were all connected with a maritime volcanic eruption? They could not. They could not make up that story. The only way they could make that story if this was an eyewitness account, that they had actually seen what had happened and wrote it down. In which case, we can have fairly good confidence that this is accurate data that's been preserved all this time. And it was preserved because they had this very close-knit society, which has changed obviously down the years, because originally with the Hyksos, they would have been Egyptian. The Hyksos have been in Egypt for at least 200 years, and they were fully Egyptianized. You could not separate them from Egyptians. They would have spoken fluent Egyptian. They were Egyptian. They venerated Egyptian gods. And we see that in the Torah account as well. But then we came on to Akhenaten, where the entire religion was changed into monotheism. And all of those gods were coalesced into one entity. And that's why there's so many contradictions within the Torah story, because it never was a monotheistic story. They've managed to force them all together. That's why the God is called, he's called Yahweh, he's called El Elohim, Shaddai, and Adon. the god of Akhenaten. And all of those gods were amalgamated into one, and kept within this very close-knit society. And I think that's probably more, well, half accident and half by design, that the leaders wanted to keep these people together. And so they were inventing this idea of persecution. I suppose you might even say that they were being persecuted. If you've just been kicked out of Egypt on an exodus, you might say you've been persecuted. But to change the fact that you were actually the controlling dynasty and you still got kicked out of Egypt, that is changing history in order to suit your political ends. And your political ends are to keep the people together as a cohesive unit. And people don't seem to, quite often I've had questions from people, they don't understand how a controlling authority, the most powerful people in Egypt and in the world, can manage to get themselves kicked out of Egypt. Well, we did exactly the same. The British did exactly the same. We were the masters of all of India, and we controlled India as the controlling authority within India. But we still got kicked out, because the controlling authority is not necessarily the majority of the population. And so you're just a controlling elite, just like the Spartans were a controlling elite within Sparta. The British were a controlling elite within India. And so, yes, for all of our technology and our power, we still got kicked out of India, and the Raj failed. That's exactly what happened to the Hyksos. So they were a controlling elite, and their Raj of Egypt failed, and they were eventually kicked out and had to find other places to go to. And so they, because of these exoduses, this is probably quite formative, actually. The reason they kept themselves together is because of these exodus events, that they had to keep themselves together as a small community wherever they went to on their exoduses. And I think they went to many places. They went to Jerusalem, of course, that's what Manetho says. I think they also went to different places across the Mediterranean, to the various Mediterranean islands as well, and set up communities there that were run by these Hyksos Israelites. And then they were kicked out again with the Akhenaten exodus. So Akhenaten and Nefertiti were kicked out of Egypt. There was no evidence for them dying in Amarna, and no evidence for them dying and being buried in Egypt. So they were kicked out of Egypt as well, which is what Manetho says. It's what Scottish history says as well. So Scottish history says the same, that the Egyptians from the Amarna dynasty were kicked out of Egypt and went to Scotland and Ireland. That was Pharaoh I and Casanamun, and they were kicked out of Egypt just after Akhenaten. So this is only like 15 years after Akhenaten. They were kicked out of Egypt, and they went to Spain, and then they went to Ireland, and then they went to Scotland. That comes from Scotti Chronicon, which is the ancient history of the Scots written in the 14th century. And it comes from the Labor Gabala, which is Irish history dating back to the 6th century AD, so very old histories. So these people went off across the Mediterranean on various exoduses, trying to keep their people together. Wow. And it was for that reason that this text survived. Despite all of the various persecutions, because obviously they've been around Europe being kicked from pillar to post, quite often because they were a separate community, they never did assimilate into a particular society. So they've always been slightly separate, keeping themselves separate, and therefore keeping their texts separate as well. And so those texts have survived into the modern era, which is quite unusual, as I say, and quite a feat, actually, to manage to keep a text going for 3,500 years, and keep it in a position where it is relatively reliable and trustworthy, that it's an original account. And one of the things I like, one of the evidences I have, apart from the Exodus we've just talked about, is the discussion between Joseph and Pharaoh, which I think is a verbatim discussion that someone actually noted down at the time, wrote it down word for word.
Yeah.
And it's there in the biblical text. It's still there 3,500 years later.
Excuse me, Ralph. Are you referring to Joseph interpreting the dream of Pharaoh?
No, but that might be true as well. No, I was referring to Joseph, where he talks to Pharaoh and he's bringing his brothers down
Oh,
into Egypt.
into Egypt.
So he brings his brothers into Egypt, and he says to his brothers, look, you're going to meet Pharaoh.
Okay.
And when you do so, you must say, you must not say that we are shepherds. You must say
Right.
that we are bull breeders, because shepherds are an abomination to the Egyptians, and you'll get thrown out of Egypt.
Mm,
Now, none of that makes any sense in agricultural terms, which is how it's portrayed nowadays. This is where they've changed the story. The story is the same. All they've done is they've changed the interpretation to suit this idea of oppression, that we were the poor shepherds in Egypt. No, you were the shepherd kings in Egypt. You were the shepherd pharaohs in Egypt. Slight difference. But what this conversation was actually talking about was the precession of the equinox again, the change between the great month of Taurus, the Apis bull, and the great month of Aries, the shepherds, the sheep, and the fact that they were the Hyksos shepherd pharaohs themselves, who had just been kicked out of Egypt. So what Joseph was saying to his brothers was, okay, when you meet Pharaoh, don't say you are Hyksos shepherd pharaohs,
mm-hmm.
because they are an abomination to the Egyptians. Well, of course they were, because they just had a civil war with these people only a couple of hundred years ago. So don't say that you are Hyksos shepherd kings. Say that you are Apis bull worshippers, and then you will be allowed to stay in the lands of Egypt. So what we have here is something that made no sense whatsoever in classical terms, in terms of agriculture. But you translate it in terms of politics, in terms of religion, in terms of the precession of the equinox, and it makes absolute perfect sense. And that's one reason why I think that is a verbatim conversation that's come out of Egypt that is 3,400 years old, something of that nature. And we still have that conversation even today.
Well, you brought to mind another scripture in the book of Joshua. Do you remember when I forget who they were, but they pretended to be these far away travelers, and there's a story, I'm sure you're familiar with it. They meet up with Joshua and they're like, well, we're some, they were saying there's somebody that they weren't. And so Joshua welcomed them in, but later on they found out, oh, I have to find the scripture, but they find out, oh, these are our enemies. But by that time they had already assimilated and come in. So there's actually a story in the book of Joshua that is similar to what you've stated. I do want to, this is really fascinating, great information. I wanted to ask you about the gods that Moses said, okay, we're going to do Yahweh, or you were going to do Yahweh, or did Moses? I don't think you really answered was there just one author? I'm thinking you're going to say there wasn't, but was it just Yahweh? Did he want to just say, okay, we're only going to do Yahweh. We're not going to do El anymore. We're not going to do Adonai. And then talk to us about after. Why did it stick? So I know you touched on a little bit, but even though they were defeated, the religion is, I'd say the most powerful religion even today, as you've alluded to. So I ask you, put a lot in there, but I want to know, can you maybe pick your brain on how Moses said, okay, this is going to be Yahweh. This is going to be Yahweh. We're going to, and then how, even though they were defeated, the religion is so strong, and it made the people still so powerful.
I think Moses, being the brother of Akhenaten, according to my view, his primary god would not have been Yahweh. His primary god would have been the Aten, which in biblical terms is the Arden, because not many people know this, actually, that the Jewish god is called Arden. And the god of Akhenaten is called the Aten or the Arden. It has exactly the same name. So, yeah. Is that widely known? I don't know. Within religious Jewish circles, I don't think it is widely known. But anyway, God has many names, as we've said, within Judaism. And one of those names is the Arden, which is the Art. It is the Aten of Akhenaten. That would have been the god of Moses, because he was the brother of Akhenaten. But as the Hyksos, previous to this time, they would have been polytheistic, of course. So the Hyksos, who are the original Israelites, and again, a lot of people don't agree with me on this, and they say, no, the Israelites and the Hyksos are separate. But Josephus Flavius, who is Judaism's greatest historian, says they are the same people. He says that the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt are our forefathers. And he says that twice in his works. So he's deliberately equating the Hyksos with the Israelites. So, but they were polytheistic, and their primary god was Set, who is Typhon in Greek terms, who in Judaic terms is Shaddai. As you probably know, that the Jewish god is called Shaddai. That is Set. That is Typhon. So
That's my name,
oh,
Shaddai.
is it? That's where it comes from, is it? Well, there you go. You're Shaddai.
And I absolutely agree with you. I'm so excited. I figured that out of my own. I find a lot of information out from you. But yes, 100% Typhon. But I'm excited to jump in and say that. But go ahead.
But then, of course, they had this problem that they came to the era of Akhenaten, which is now like 300 years later. And suddenly there is this move towards monotheism. Akhenaten was the first of the monotheists. And he had a problem. How do you amalgamate all of these gods into one god? So he amalgamated everything under the Aten, but the Aten was a sun god. Yahweh is not. Yahweh is the moon god. Again, people don't seem to realize this, but Yahweh is an Egyptian god. Yah is the Egyptian moon. So Yahweh is the moon god of Egypt. And Elohim, Allah, because Allah or Allah is the Judaic god. It's not just the Arabic one. El became, in Greek, it became Helios. Helios. El is the sun god again. So Yahweh is the moon god, El is the sun god, Shaddai is Set, Typhon, and they wanted to amalgamate all of these gods under the Aten as being a single god figure. But that god figure was based on the sun again. The Aten, if it's based on anything, it's based on the image and the rays of the sun. So we're back to a solar god here. But Judaism, as it's come down to us, is a moon religion. Their calendar is a lunar calendar, whereas the calendar of Akhenaten was a solar calendar. So quite obviously, the reforms that Akhenaten made upon this religion didn't fully hold. we still have the 4 or 5 names of the Judaic god, which represent the original Egyptian gods, and the solar god of Akhenaten and the solar calendar of Akhenaten was changed back again into what we know for modern Judaism, which is all lunar. And so you can see there were lots of factions fighting for supremacy within this growing religion and society. Old Egypt went back to the old gods, of course. As soon as Akhenaten was kicked out of Egypt, they all went back to the old gods. And it was only maintained, the Aten was only maintained by the refugees from Egypt of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And there weren't many of those. Remember that Manetho says there were only 80,000 lepers and maimed priests, who are the people of Akhenaten who were banished to the quarries on the east bank of the Nile. So, and they only stayed there for, I think it was about 20 years. It wasn't very long. So after 20 years, there probably still only 100,000 people maximum. So when they were pushed out onto their exodus, it wouldn't have been very many people. It's only 100,000 people being pushed out across the Mediterranean and going out to the north of the Delta and going out towards Jerusalem. So how much influence would they have had? I'm not sure they would have had that much influence. I wonder if I've got a quick quotation here, because people don't always believe this. This is from Manetho, and Manetho is writing about the history of Egypt. So he's not Jewish. He's an Egyptian historian, 3rd century BC, and he's writing a history of Egypt as he knows it. And he's saying, and this is quoted by Josephus, of course. This has come down secondhand to us. And Josephus says, now Manetho, in another of his books, says that this nation were called shepherds, and they were also called captives in their sacred books. And this account of his is the truth. For the feeding of sheep was the employment of our forefathers. So this is Josephus making a direct correlation between the Hyksos and the Israelites. He's calling them our forefathers. And as such, they led a wandering life in feeding sheep because they were called shepherds. Nor was it without reason that they were called captives by the Egyptians, since one of our ancestors, Joseph, told the king of Egypt that he was a captive. Again, he's connecting the Israelites and the Hyksos. And afterwards sent for his brethren into Egypt by the king's permission. That wasn't necessarily the quote I wanted. Here it is. Then it's talking about the Exodus, and it says, then they went their way with their whole families and effects, no fewer in number than 240,000. This is talking about the Hyksos Exodus, not the biblical Exodus. This is talking about real history. So, okay, I'll go back on that one. So it says, they went away with their whole families and effects, no fewer in number than 240,000, and took their journey from Egypt through the wilderness towards Syria. But as they were in fear of the Assyrians, who then had dominion over Asia, they built a city in that country, which is now called Judea, and that large enough to contain this great number of men, and called it Jerusalem. That is the ancient history of the Hyksos, not from the biblical text, but you can see the parallels there. I mean, there are great parallels there. So yeah, that's talking about Moses. So yeah.
Wow. See, this is awesome to sit with you. I hope to do this again. I look forward to hearing more from you, Esoteric. has so much information that you have on this channel from Esoteric. So I want to thank Esoteric for having you here, and you're invaluable to those of us who want to get to the truth. We're tired of these lies that are being pushed to us. I'm
And,
speaking for all the people. So thank you
yeah.
so much once again.
And I want to thank Esoteric as well, because he's done a grand job of tapping into a whole new range of viewers that I've not had before, building up his site, which has grown from small beginnings to a big oak tree. So yeah, doing a grand job. And thanks very much for having me on yet again. Thank you.